So we're going to spend the first bit talking about trauma-informed lens and a little bit around PTSD, really an overview and highlighting some of the interventions at a real global level. You'll find in advanced interventions, we're going to talk a bit more about the intervention piece. So today is really what it means to use a trauma-informed approach as we are working with young people who have a variety of mental health concerns, and what that means for you as CYCs. Hey Hannah, if at any point during this conversation today that we're having, it causes you any distress, we are talking about trauma, some topics might come up, and then we are talking about PTSD. So if at any point you need to take a break from the content, that is completely up to you. A little different in Zoom because we're not in a classroom. So what I just ask is if something is causing you any distress, you can send me a private note in chat and just let me know if you've had to leave or whatever decision you made. If we were in class, I would see you leave. So I just want to make sure I'm checking in with everyone in case anything we talk about is triggering in any way, okay? So the last part of class, we're going to spend doing the in-class assignment. So hopefully you've been able to sign up for groups online. If you haven't found a group, no problem. We will sort that out when the time comes. So I think that's it. And then we'll spend the last bit of class. You guys will work independently in breakout rooms, completing the in-class trauma lens assignment. Once you are done that, your class is done for the day. There's no further lesson after that, okay? And I'll recap a little bit what I'm expecting about the assignment when it comes to that time. So any questions or comments before we start this week? No, Emily, thanks, okay. I love the nonverbals, Tina. I rely on these so much in the virtual world, let me tell you. Okay, let me pop up our lesson content for today. So let me just get myself here. All right. So today we're looking at trauma, and I know you are taking trauma and abuse with Andy. She and I talked, and I don't think there is too much that's a duplication, and hopefully it sets a stage for her course moving forward. So I'm fingers crossed there's not a lot you're like, oh, we already learned that. So for this week, I'd asked you to read chapter 2 and then have a look at the DSM criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. And then there was also a reading about post-traumatic stress disorder and young people. When we talk about trauma, what we're referring to, it's kind of like the 3 E's are used as a way to explain it. There's an event that's experienced that has effects. That in and of itself is kind of the 3 key features of a trauma. But in this case, the event that's been experienced is experienced in a way that's either physically or psychologically harmful or life-threatening. And then the effects that happen are long-lasting. We all may experience a variety of events that are distressing, that cause us psychological distress, emotional distress. Oftentimes we're able to rebound, cope, have supports in place, and move beyond that. When we're not able to, that is potentially when a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, which we'll talk about later, comes in. But for now, what are some examples of a traumatic experience or event that a young person might experience? And it's on a giant continuum. There's a huge variety here. No right or wrong. So what would you suggest, a traumatic event or experience?
Like right now, the pandemic is probably traumatic for a lot of young people.
Okay, how so?
They might feel really isolated. They might have family members who get COVID and die. They might get COVID. Like there's a lot of different ways that could impact them physically and emotionally.
Right. So isolation, I heard. Fear for self, fear for others. Okay. How else might this pandemic be experienced in a way that's traumatic for young people? And I'm opening this up to the group. Tatiana.
They cannot interact with their peers.
Sorry, I'm turning, can you speak a little louder, and I'm going to change my volume up.
They cannot interact with their peers.
Okay, so they're missing that social connection. Sure, right. Building on that isolation, another feature of it. Good. What else might be traumatic for young people?
Abuse rates tend to go up because parents are stuck at home, so then they get easily frustrated, and food insecurity has risen a lot.
Okay, Andrea, what an interesting point you're raising, because it's not necessarily the pandemic itself with the fear for health. It's the situation that are being caused as a result of the pandemic. You got it, absolutely. And we're seeing young people who would normally be in school with you at your placement are now at home, right? And perhaps there is lack of access to nutrition, as Andrea is pointing out. Perhaps there's a dynamic at home that's stressful. We are also dealing with a population of parents who are stressed. So, how is that impacting the children, and how is that changing the relationship between parent and child during this time of right now a lockdown, but since March, right? Yeah, absolutely. Anything we missed, how the pandemic might be experienced in a traumatic way by a young person?
Well, building on what Andrea said, like addiction levels are going back up too, and what's the word I'm looking for? Well, when you get sober, relapse keeps happening as well, right? And so that's traumatic for kids or youth, sorry.
Right, for young people, teenagers, emerging adults who are walking through the world right now. And Sheena, you made a point that made me think about, well, this in of itself is not necessarily traumatic, although I shouldn't say it's not, because it could be experienced that way. We have a population of young people, especially those with mental health concerns, who had been connected with supports previously, who may have seen a counselor weekly, who may have valued going into that office and seeing the counselor, who may have attended groups where they had a significant amount of peer support. And so now that's removed or changed. And so that's traumatic when that is your lifeline, right? So good. Thanks for pointing that out. Anything else to add to how young people are experiencing the pandemic?
Just to add on to what Andrea said as well, not only toxic relationships or abuse from parents, but also from siblings or from partners or anything like that.
Interesting point you're making. So whether there's more incidents of woman abuse or partner violence happening in the home, absolutely. And not being able to escape a sibling who could have been perpetuating abuse towards you, or a step sibling. Excellent point. Yeah. And that leads to another type of trauma, right, that young people can be experiencing. Tatiana, did you want to contribute? I saw your mic off.
No, but I was thinking maybe also the ones that have some kind of disease that they cannot be treated. So there's the stress of not being able to go to the hospital if something happened, or maybe their mom is having cancer or something. So this discussion between the family members, we cannot go. So this causes the stress also.
Right. Great example. So whereby normally you could see a person who is ill, now you're removed from having access to them, and perhaps even having access to information. Sydney posted a comment. It came just to me, but I'll read it out loud. Thanks, Sydney. And she's naming a trigger warning, and I think we did that at the beginning, and we can do that throughout the class, Sydney. Thank you for doing that. When we're talking about childhood sexual abuse, right? Then you have, if that's happening now, and the child doesn't have the escape of soccer, hockey, school, for example, the neighbor's house. How they're experiencing that during a pandemic increases the adverse effect and increased isolation, of fear of being alone with a specific person. That's right, Sydney, thanks. Sometimes that happens in chat. If it's just to the host, it just doesn't go to everyone, no problem. Anyone else want to contribute? Another type of trauma, and I'm just going to scroll down, actually, we can talk about this. There are two different types of trauma when I'm looking. For example, one is acute and one is chronic. And so when we think back to when the pandemic first occurred, do you remember back last March, and we were all asked to stay home? That would be an example of something that's acute, that comes on without necessarily without warning, and is one main incident that is going to contribute to the lasting effects of a situation. Or chronic. Chronic would be the example Sydney was giving around sexual abuse, or living with partner, witnessing partner violence at home, being in a relationship that's abusive. That's a type of chronic trauma because it's ongoing, and there's no official unnecessarily start and end, right? So if you think about those two categories, acute versus chronic trauma, what kind of examples come to mind? I'll ask you to give the example and what type of trauma, how you would label it, in what category.
Acute could be like seeing a car crash, so like witnessing a traumatic event.
Excellent. Right. So witnessing an event, perhaps a school incident that's happened at school, witnessing an assault that happens once, perhaps without a connection to that person, even your own immediate injury that happens at a quick pace, without warning, without expectation. Yeah. Marissa. Hey, Marissa. A death in the family. Absolutely. It could be acute, but it could be chronic. I like the how you've said that there, because it can, right? It can be chronic if a child's been living and a parent at home has cancer or has a terminal illness, but has been under treatment. And so it's been going on for a year, 2 years, or it could be acute if the parent gets a quick diagnosis and passes right away, or to Emily's point, perhaps there's an incident that resulted in their death. Hannah, that came from war and have PTSD would be chronic. Yes, great example, because you're looking at a group of young people who have lived through constant violence, constant aggression, and constantly in a state of fear. Well, we look at a child in that situation, their nervous system is always going to be firing and their fight or flight reflex is always going to be activated. So that's a super example of chronic, because of, yeah, the prolonged exposure to any event is going to increase your, you're always going to be, when we'll talk in a minute about, but your state of arousal is always going to be heightened, because you're always going to be scanning for some type of threat, even if you don't know you're doing it. Your nervous system is always going to be more active in the amygdala, because that is going to be scanning for any threat in the environment, right? Okay, neglect, chronic neglect, Tatiana, absolutely. It's something a child, any scenario that a child is experiencing that has an adverse effect over a period of time would be considered a chronic trauma. Anything that happens immediate and usually without warning, something unexpected, is more of an acute incident. It still has adverse lasting effects, both traumatic but different. Chronic could include bullying, sexual abuse, domestic violence. Yeah, you got it. Why the distinction is important is no matter the trauma, there are going to be similar effects. How it impacts how the nervous system operates, how it impacts your experience of trust of the world outside, others outside of you, how it impacts your beliefs about yourself. However, you may find in an acute trauma, the introduction of supports and the availability of resources is higher. So think, Emily, to your example, we kind of expand on that and we think, say there was an incidence of a school shooting at a school, okay? That's an acute trauma. In that case, many children have experienced that together. There's going to be an umbrella of supports that come in to help that group of young people process what has happened. So sometimes when the trauma is acute, it becomes, services are more accessible and readily available versus a chronic trauma where we may not know what's happening. Think of a child living with neglect at home, as Tatiana suggested, or chronic bullying, chronic sexual abuse, chronic domestic violence happening in the home that people may not disclose out of shame or fear. The supports they need are going to be a little bit different. And that's the importance of making the distinction. So the two key points are, it's really important to understand how the child's been impacted and what supports were available or were not during the period that the trauma was occurring, okay? The language here, pain-based behavior. Why do you think we use that when we're trying to understand behavior and understand what we might be seeing in young people who have been, or who we think may have experienced a type of trauma? Why do you think the language of pain-based behavior is important to use? And remember to contribute, you can use the chat if you raise your hand function, because jumping in is hard. I will absolutely get to you, or if I see you on mic, go ahead and contribute. Pain-based behavior. Why is that important piece when we're trying to understand what we're seeing? And you can think of the distinction rather than saying acting out behavior, the difference between acting out behavior versus pain-based. What does that do to us? What's the value of using our language really effectively? Okay, so Cindy, you're highlighting kind of you're indicating that the behavior we're seeing has to do with a specific experience. And that's the connection you're making. Sure, yeah, absolutely. What else? Sheena, because understanding the behavior comes from somewhere, that it's not necessarily characteristic of that child or who that child is, but rather what we're seeing is telling us something. It's coming from a place of pain rather than intention to act out, as most behaviors we observe in young people, right? Okay.
Or if it seems like it doesn't fit the situation or the trigger, it would be from more internal and like pain-based from somewhere else.
Okay, interesting. Do you have an example of one you can think of?
I guess like if a child like in the morning, like their family, there's a lot of conflict or there's domestic violence, so they're already triggered and thinking about that, and they come to school and the teacher is like, can you get your pencil out to start working? And they're like, what the fuck? Like, how could you ask this of me? And it's the response isn't to that expectation, but what's going on before.
Yeah, so it's a signal. It tells us, and we'll get to it in the next, I think as I scroll down, their window of tolerance is very low. So anything, however small, that gives them any type of experience of threat, i.e. a teacher saying, get your pencil out, for them is too much. It's too much of an expectation because their window of tolerance for anything, because their state of arousal is too high, and their ability to cope and behave in a way that's regulated is challenged. So yeah, really good example. Shelby, the behavior has a purpose, right? It's they're not calling out for help. Sorry, my mouse is over that. They may not be calling out for help or not knowing they're in pain. All the behavior we see is generally going to be reflective of a need. Whatever that need is, doesn't have to make sense to us. We just have to understand that it's a need and then investigate what need can we help address. Good. Okay. How might you see calling out for help? Emily, you gave us a really good good example. When we're trying to understand pain-based behavior, especially of those who've been exposed to trauma, and this could be kind of related to any child really, but in this lesson we're focusing specifically to trauma. We're recognizing their nervous system is dysregulated. Their capacity to adapt and operate at an optimal level is compromised because their nervous system isn't allowing it. It's not a choice at this point. Their nervous system is dysregulated and out of balance. So how might we see that in a school setting? So think of the examples you gave earlier. How might we see that appear in the young people we work with, whether it's in an elementary school setting or other?
Chewing, like nervous physical acts, like chewing your lip or like even peeling the skin around your thumbs.
Okay, good. Small acts, right? But what a sign that the child or person is doing something to maintain a level of regulation. So this small act is helping that child work towards regulating their nervous system and regain a sense of balance. Likely not doing the job completely, right? But it's a cue that perhaps something is not settled. There's lacking some type of balance there. Tatiana, did you want to add something?
I was thinking maybe when the behavior is not according to what is expected for the situation of for what is asked. Maybe the teacher is just asking something simple and the kid just respond as Emily was
Yes.
saying, so it's not according to what it should be.
That is your clue. Tatiana, you've said it perfectly. Anytime the reaction doesn't match the situation in a way that you anticipate it would, recognizing that there we have our own norms and biases about how people should behave, but putting that aside a little bit, whenever the reaction doesn't align with the expectation, that's a cue for you to say something more is going on. So I say, get out your pencil. The kid says, fuck off, I can't do this. That's a sign for me that something's not aligning, because my request doesn't align with that type of reaction. So I have to figure out what is happening, and my goal in that moment is to help that child regulate. All of your work with young people is going to center around helping them regulate before you can make requests of them. Because when in a dysregulated state, they can't access the part of their brain they need to perform simple tasks sometimes. Sydney, yeah, exactly. Exactly where we're going, Sydney, you're right on track. I read that, I said it, and then you had posted before I read that. Yeah. Behavior doesn't match the severity. Okay, good. Let's listen. Well, actually, no. We'll come back to this. So here we're looking at, this picture gives you an idea of, if you kind of picture children on each of these kind of all over this chart. So generally, we all operate within our normal range, which is going to be different for Sheena as it is for me, as it is for Andrea, etc., right? But we all operate within this normal range for us. When a traumatic event occurs, we are generally going to be either increased and our arousal is going to go too high, and we may be stuck in the on position because our brain is operating in a way that we are under threat. So our brain is reacting in a way to sense danger and keep us safe by activating our fight or flight reflex. Okay, so we may see anxiety, panic, hyperactivity. You may see a child who has a really hard time relaxing. They may be really restless in class as they're sitting there. There may be hypervigilant, which means being very mindful of their surroundings at all times, constantly scanning for threat. You may see digestive problems because their nervous system isn't allowing that digestion to go through because they're not even able to reach that rest or digest stage, okay? Emotional flooding, which means the access to parts of their brain that help them with logic and reason are overcome with emotion. And so that's when we're talking about emotional flooding, sleeplessness, hostility, and rage, because the arousal level is so high that any trigger is going to set a young person off. Or as a result of the trauma, a child may get stuck in off where their arousal levels are so low. So you may see depression, a flat affect, exhaustion, chronic fatigue, disorientation, a lack of connection to the space and the world around them. And again, digestion, physiology is always impacted, whether our arousal is too high or too low. Anyone have an example to share of a young person they may have worked with where you've observed some of these behaviors and can make the connection to their experience of a traumatic event? Does anything come to mind for anyone?
Well, I work right now at a group home, and one of the girls, she gets fixated on, well, there's two clients. So one of them leaves, sorry, she gets really fixated on that. And like I see her anxiety spike, like she'll be like, where does so and so go? When is she coming back? Why does she leave? Can we leave? And whenever it always happens whenever she leaves, because she's like her comfort blanket, and like she's kind of like her sister to her. So whenever she leaves, like it throws her off the walls, and like her anxiety spikes up. Like every 30 minutes, like she'll come and she'll ask me, why did she leave? Where is she coming? Like, can we go find her? And yeah.
And what you mentioned, it's her comfort blanket. What is her behavior telling you?
Because she doesn't really do good with change, and especially because I work during the night mostly. So whenever I work during the day, like I'm already new to her. So like the other client is usually like who she looks for comfort, and like she'll look at her, and like she kind of like calms down. But like when she's not there and I'm only there, she's like, okay, like you're new, the person I know is not here. What's going on? What's happening? And like how do I go back to normal?
Right? How do I regulate in an environment where I feel unsafe? Well, there's not an actual threat.
Yeah.
Her experience of not having safety in her space is experienced as a threat, right? Think of yourselves whenever something that, think of a scenario where you maybe haven't had supports or the structure in place you need to feel safe. Well, even on small levels, right? Where you may feel a bit more stressed or anxious in an environment because you don't have the right supports or what you need to feel safe. And then picture the young person, Halima, what a brilliant example, because she seems to be more stuck in the dysregulated, the hyperarousal state, right? We heard in your example, the hypervigilance, the anxiety, a little bit of panic, it sounds like, and some stress around that. Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Let me ask another question. How does the team or you respond to that?
Well, normally whenever she does ask, like she has like a plan set in place where like she asks her a lot of repetitive questions. So like I answer her like once and I give her a clear cut answer. So like whenever she does ask again, like I divert her to something else, to like another task. I'm like, okay, like, hey, let's go paint our nails or let's go do this. And I kind of get her mind off of it, which is not always the easiest thing because she'll be like, well, just ask, ask me for the last time. Just tell me, I promise I won't ask again.
Right.
So it's hard. I'm not gonna lie. At times it's like really hard because like I feel bad for her because like I could see that she's stressed out. She's like really anxious, but there's not a real threat. And I'm like, no, she's gonna come back, or she's at school, or like, hey, let's go like do this, or let's go see what this is on. Like, do you want to help me in the kitchen? So it's a lot of like diverting.
A tough job, right? Especially because for this young person, it's real, the threat.
Yeah.
And so if I feel like I'm in danger and you're telling me you want to go paint your nails, no, actually, I don't want to paint my nails. I want to feel safe, right? So
Yeah.
and all of those efforts are brilliant in that the purpose, it sounds to me, is to decrease her state of hyperarousal and help her reach a state of regulating. I think you used the word through diverting, through helping her redirect her attention elsewhere for the short term to give her brain a break and give her an opportunity to regulate. Not an easy task. Good for you for working with her. Thank you for that example.
Thank you.
I see a comment up here from Sydney. A student you're working with wets themselves when they hear loud adult male yelling. Thankfully, the school is small, so it's not a major issue, but something you've been told of. So you're aware of that in advance, which is so important. We often don't get that information in school settings to know children's triggers. So brilliant, so that you have information so you can help them feel safe. And he has a stress toy to help him find his center if necessary. So whatever tool that helps them find some way to cue their brain to regulate is going to be so important, because when you're stuck on or off, getting back to neutral is incredibly, incredibly difficult. And then when you are in either state, your window of tolerance is what is going to be impacted. So you may be in a state of hyperarousal or hypoarousal, right? So either top or bottom, but your window of tolerance is basically, think of yourself when you feel like you can deal with things. This was me yesterday. My window of tolerance was very low, but I had to acknowledge that. So when your window of tolerance is optimal, you feel like, okay, I can handle what's happening. If there's a stress that comes my way, I believe I have the capacity to cope, or I can get the supports I need to address the stress that's happening. It doesn't bother you as much. You can tolerate it. However, when your window of tolerance, when you're outside of your window of tolerance, your capacity is impacted. And that's the challenge, because you're either really anxious, feeling out of control, or overwhelmed, dysregulated. So your body wants to fight or run away. So your reaction and your reactivity is so high when you're hyper aroused and your window of tolerance has been breached. Emily's example earlier was a brilliant example of that. Or hypoarousal, your reactions just take over. You may zone out, you may freeze. If you've ever worked with young people, you may see this, Halima, at the group home, or those of you that have worked with youth, you may, or yourselves, you may find you go inward, you zone out, you emotionally freeze and you shut down. That's another way of trying to manage and tolerate this threat to your psychological well-being and your state of homeostasis, your state of optimal functioning. Okay. So we know that when the brain reacts to trauma. So the trauma responses are, the amygdala is what is getting the signal, the fire alarm is going off. Our thinking brain, our prefrontal cortex, is assessing the situation. But when our amygdala is firing and sounding the alarm, our prefrontal cortex goes offline. It's not going to be accessible to us as it would be when we were feeling regulated. So our emotional brain is activating that fight or flight recess. We want to be able to access our thinking brain so that it can shut down the alarm and help us calm down, but we have to regulate before we can access our thinking brain. So what Halima, the example she gave, was our mechanisms to how do you work with young people to help them regain a state so that they can make decisions, access choice, decision-making, judgment, critical thinking, all of those skills you need when you're trying to assess a situation. Okay, we are going to listen to a few examples. These are some examples you may have heard in a school setting. You'll probably hear them and think, oh, I can imagine a teacher or an educator or a professional I've worked with saying something like this. I want to give a little disclaimer. So while in all of these situations, they're all educators, not all educators aren't trauma informed. So this could be applicable to any type of professional who's not trauma informed. So you're going to be listening to scenarios. I want you to listen for what you're hearing in the message the professional is conveying, okay? Are you hearing any deficit-oriented statements rather than a strength-based focus? And I'm going to ask you to challenge yourself to reframe the educator perspective from deficit to strength-based. You can use the chat for this as you're going. So those of you that haven't contributed with your camera on, feel free to use the chat and contribute that way. How can you reframe what you're hearing? What is the behavior telling you about the young person? Okay, so I'm going to switch screens here. We'll do a few examples together. All right. Okay, tell me if you can't hear it.
I don't know what gets into that young man. If someone just looks at him the wrong way, he bolts out of the classroom and runs down the hall. We usually find him wandering around outside. By 9th grade, you would have thought he'd learn how to talk things out with someone that makes him mad. I guess we're just going to have to bar the door and keep him in class.
She went under the table and crawled into a little ball. No matter what I said, she wouldn't budge. She acted just like a little kid trying to hide from me. And of course, she got everyone's attention. So I took her out to the hallway.
Okay, we'll come back to that one. In the first one, what did you hear? What message were you hearing from the educator that indicated it was deficit oriented? Marissa, thank you for that. I don't know what's wrong with the boy. And you could reframe that to say, I'm concerned for him and want to find the best way to support his needs. So making a distinction, you're still saying something's up. However, what a big difference that reframing of language does, eh? Excellent. What else did you guys hear and how might you change that?
That I think by this age he could talk things out versus I think he needs support building like conversational skills or conflict resolution skills.
So missing what lag of skill might be contributing to it. And you brought up something else, Emily, that's really important. So when we look in your textbook, it's on, I have the page here. Page 95, sorry, I have a few windows open. So whenever we are seeing a situation, trying to interpret a situation, we want to say, okay, do I have all the historical info to understand what could be happening? Is substance abuse an issue? Is this an act of self-harm? Is self-harm contributing? What is the function of the behavior? So while I see this young person behaving that way, how are they using that behavior to function, cope, or adapt? Any cultural aspects I'm missing? And then Emily, this was the point I wanted to come to. Have you assessed the developmental stage? So when the trauma occurred or now? We may see behaviors in young people that are reflective of the age they may have been when the trauma occurred, if there was an interruption in their ability to develop and learn coping skills or develop traits attached to that developmental stage. So really important to understand, okay, if a young person experienced trauma from ages 3 to 7, there are likely a variety of skills and developmental stages they've missed. So we may see that in the behavior and how they're acting. And what is that? What is their current developmental stage and what's misaligned there? what are their vulnerabilities and resources and supports. The example Sydney gave earlier around, there was the young boy who the male voice was triggering, right? Knowing those things, did something in the environment trigger this young person? Are you focusing on the relationship? Is the safety been established? And what are you doing to help that young person self-regulate? Shelby, when someone looks at him the wrong way, he bolts. He may be intimidated by eye contact and in need of social development. Is he experiencing that as a threat, therefore reacting in that way to create safety? Well, there's not an actual threat. Is that his experience? Excellent. Okay. Let's listen to, I'm going to go to the next one because that one.
That little boy will literally tear up the entire classroom. He throws chairs at other kids and knocks off all the books from the shelves. He just goes totally out of control. The other kids just look at him like he's crazy. I know they're all scared of him and I don't blame them. He's a scary kid.
Okay, deficit-oriented language in that vignette.
Could we possibly say how she uses how the other kids are scared of him to validate her fear? And she kind of says, like, she kind of uses as a co-signing, like, hey, they think the same thing I think.
Yeah, interesting, Halima. I when I listened to it, I hadn't picked up on that angle. I think absolutely, because what it sounds to me, if I hear it that way, that she's aligning with an us versus him.
Yeah.
And that's not a helpful approach to, especially as helping professional, but in any situation, when you create an us them, there's the capacity to work together and be open-minded and not judgmental is gone. Excellent. Anyone else? What about right at the end? How did she label him?
She called him a scary kid.
Okay. Yeah, Hannah. So, and Emily, thank you. So you're working with a child and you have this idea in your mind, he's a scary kid. How is that going to impact how you develop a relationship with them? What does that do to you as a CYC? Emily.
You go in and you are scared of him instead of saying that this kid is probably scared and that's why they're responding that way.
Right. Right. They are scared. This child needs you. Right? And that's what their behavior is telling you. There was a young person I worked with at the shelter, and he'd been living with a parent, a father who was quite abusive towards mom, and they had come to the shelter, and he was just adjusting to being there, but he aligned with his father. He believed that mom shouldn't have left, and really, really angry at mom and hated being at the shelter. He was 9 years old, really aggressive to mom and towards his sister. And I can't recall the actual situation that triggered him. There was something, and he began to tear apart the front kind of whole entranceway. He went quite aggressive and quite violent. I think he was angry at mom wouldn't let him go skateboarding, if I'm remembering correctly, because the last time she took him, he hit her over the head with a skateboard. And so she took away the skateboard park because it was too dangerous, something like that. And something happened and he was so reactive, very dysregulated. His window of tolerance was very small. He was always in a state of hyperarousal and directed his aggression towards mom. One of the CYCs I was working with was trying to calm him down. And because he was aggressive, the approach originally taken was to try and kind of control the surroundings and control the environment, which his perception of that was it was a threat. About 40 minutes in to this, he still had not regulated or calmed down or had any sense of safety, and went and sat under the cloakroom closets, like there were all the big coats hanging. And so we decided to try something different. And so it was my turn to try. And I went and I crawled into the closet and I just sat there with him and tried to understand what pain he was going through, because the behavior we were seeing wasn't because he didn't want to assault anyone. He didn't want to destroy the walls. He didn't want to destroy any chairs or anything. He was in pain. And I sat with him, and I had the benefit of him being quite exhausted at that point because he had been going for about 40 minutes. And I turned to him and I said, hey, so-and-so, it's really hard to be a kid right now in this situation, isn't it? And he just collapsed and he sobbed and he sobbed and he sobbed. But it's trying to figure out what is the function of the pain-based behavior and what is it telling you. And then when you can figure out what it's telling you versus how you want to control the situation, or how you want to step in, or what you think could be useful, it's more important to try and pick up the cues and understand what does that child need, because that's what behaviors are telling us. And whenever possible, try and meet that need in a way that makes sense to you. Okay, I'm cognizant of the time. We won't do any more vignettes. They are available to you on, you click this link and you want to listen to a few more. And just let's go over post-traumatic stress disorder briefly. So post-traumatic stress disorder is what happens when trauma has been experienced at a major level. You've either been exposed to it, you've witnessed it, or you've experienced it. There are many, many, many types of trauma that will lead to PTSD, but the two features that have to occur are the trauma must be life-threatening to lead to potential or actual serious injury, or the child or teen reacted to the trauma with intense fear, helplessness, or horror. So a real extreme visceral reaction of fear to a situation that has occurred. Now, we know this is a big gap between numbers. I recognize that 15 to 43, it's quite broad, but we know 15 to 43% of children will experience some type of traumatic event in their lives. Think back to the examples you gave earlier on in the lesson. Many of them won't develop PTSD. The chance of developing PTSD increases with the severity of the trauma, but even still, not all children will experience and receive a diagnosis of PTSD. Only 5% actually of adolescents in the US are generally diagnosed with PTSD in their lifetime. Why do you think that happens? What might make the difference between a young person experiencing a really adverse, scary life event, but doesn't develop post-traumatic stress disorder?
Having protective factors and like resiliency.
What's an example, excellent, of a protective factor that may mediate a symptom developing?
A strong family support, so then you're able to talk about it right away. They're aware of what's happened in your life. Perhaps that means that they're going to set up like mental health support or other things.
Excellent, right? We know that if an abuser is outside of the family, a stranger perhaps, or someone not connected to the family at all, the capacity for the family to intervene and provide a supportive, grounding, safe space is increased. Yeah, Marissa, absolutely. They have support available immediately. So perhaps an interesting point you're raising here. How does privilege play into how you can recover from a trauma, right? Think about what services are available, what culturally responsive services are available that a young person wants to access when they've been traumatized. Are there enough, right? And we often see that in the Ottawa community. There's a bit of a limited, when we look at trauma-centered services, a limited diversity of what's available. So I love that point. Anything else you want to add about what might make the difference between how a young person processes and experiences an event that we didn't cover?
I don't know if this like falls under that umbrella, but I know for a lot of people, like something traumatic happens during your childhood and you don't realize until you're older, like, hey, that should have never happened. Then they start to act upon the consequences of that action that another person or that could have possibly done to them. And I know that like messes up a lot of like adults because they're like, hey, like this happened to me as a kid. Now I'm older, I realize that should have never happened. And how do I deal with that burden from that past, I guess? Like I know they say like forgive your inner child, or like you have to heal the child in you so you can heal the adult in you.
Yeah.
I don't know if that falls under this.
No, it does. And it's a really, really relevant example in that as a child, as we experience trauma, we may engage in behaviors that help us cope and are adaptable, help us adapt as we are children. And we may repress or suppress our emotional experience, our psychological experience of what has happened. When we are older and we have the capacity, sometimes the language, the words, the resources to process what has happened, and those experiences are more at the forefront, that can be really traumatic for us. And we have to find a way to navigate that. Sheena, you're saying, yeah, like trauma is almost normal to some youth. Tell me more about that. What do you mean? An example. It's good.
Like if you go home every day and your alcoholic dad is beating up your mom, and or like your mom is on drugs and you don't really see the fact that she's doing drugs, but she's sleeping all the time when she comes down, or like little things like that, and you think, oh, it's normal, and you don't have like the knowledge of what's actually going on until you're older, and like these things that just slap you in the face, like when you get 20, you're just like, oh well, shit.
Right.
So then all these behaviors kind of become normal, like, and then you get some kids that say like, wow, your parents kissed, that's weird, like I didn't know that parents actually loved each other, like, so like these bad things just are normal to them, and it's kind of bizarre to them that good things happen.
Right. So the chronic trauma, the nature of the chronic exposure to any type of dynamic or any type of home situation, when you're out of it, can open up the need for you to process how that is different and how that's impacted you and how you approach your relationships as an adult. Yeah, absolutely. And then intervention is required. Emily, and I'm watching the chat, but Emily, go ahead.
Or I guess how like with that is that the symptoms of PTSD might not show up until then, and also how it's post-traumatic. Like if you're in a chronic traumatic experience until you're 18, like you're not experiencing PTSD until you leave that.
Right, right. Yeah, it's really tricky. I would suggest in many situations where young people are in type of chronic experiences and later in life process it, where it didn't involve, and I'm simply suggesting it, anything that was extreme and life-threatening. That's the distinction when PTSD generally develops, or the experience of the event was life-threatening. Certainly what Sheena and Emily, you guys are talking about is stressful and traumatic. But whether a diagnosis of PTSD would come into play has to do with the experience of the event as life-threatening. Is one of the big pieces. And it could that young person that Sheena was giving the example could have experienced that as life-threatening, and later for sure PTSD is an option. That's the big distinction there. And Sydney, you're talking about normalizing, right? Don't know what it's like not to live through abuse, or not to have trauma in your life, or not to have some type of dysfunction around you that's impacting your relationships. When we're talking about PTSD, we're looking at 4 key symptoms. So if these symptoms are present, irrelevant of what kind of my example of, or my suggestion that the situation had to be extreme, if these symptoms are present, the young person would qualify for a DSM, a diagnosis of PTSD in the DSM, because this is a criteria we're looking for. So if they're, yeah.
Sorry, I hate interrupting.
Okay.
Did you say in order to have PTSD, it had to have been a life-threatening event?
The experience of it, the person who experienced the event had to believe and experience that it was life-threatening for them.
Like in a sense where they're literally thinking my life is in danger, or their fight or flight response is saying that?
Well, it would come from a place of fight or flight, because that would be their experience of it. So that it would be really important. How did the person who experienced the event believe it was impacting their safety, their psychological well-being, their physical safety? Yeah. It doesn't.
Is it specifically their safety, or could it be seeing someone else's safety is in danger?
Yeah, it could be observing an event that was life-threatening, or potential acts. Here we're looking at trauma was life-threatening or lead to potential or actual serious injury. It could be witnessing an event as well, because here we're talking about actual or serious injury, but I'm also telling you that it's psychological injury or physical. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a type of physical threat where I believed I was in danger too. Okay, that makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So what has to happen? So say, for example, and I'm just going to talk about sexual assault for a second, giving a little warning about that. If you experienced a sexual assault, the intensity of that experience on you could lead to a PTSD diagnosis. So while that person is potentially not at risk of being murdered or killed or dying, the experience of that threat is so severe that at a psychological level, it's so threatening to their overall well-being and capacity to cope and function that would be one of the events that could qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD. Okay, so not life-threatening, however, experienced in a way that was really, really damaging. The outcome, there are 4 categories. So you see intrusion symptoms. So that is a reliving of a trauma in some way, often regularly, unexpected, without control over the insertion of the traumatic memories into your everyday. And that's why the language of intrusion, they come in, they're unexpected, you can't control them. And you're reliving the experience you went through. Persistent avoidance is the second symptom. So that is when you do everything to avoid anything that reminds you of the trauma, because acknowledging and managing the trigger is going to be too overwhelming, and your capacity to do that is non-existent. Negative changes in cognition and mood. So you may develop negative beliefs about yourself or others and have really strong feelings of fear, anger, rage. And your arousal and reactivity is increasingly high. So this is when you may be in a state of hyperarousal. You're easily startled. You're often walking through your daily world in a fight or flight mode because you don't have the capacity to regulate, because you're still experiencing the threat and the fear. That's real to you as you walk through your everyday life. Okay, the DSM there. Children and teens with PTSD usually develop some symptoms from each of these categories. Oh, sorry. Yes? Apologies. I just looked down and there was a little person at my knee. Symptoms do last for more than 1 month, and the symptoms create distress or impair your capacity to function. That's kind of the caveat out there. They must happen over time and impair your functioning. There's a story here, we won't have time to do it, but and here's a kind of a picture of you for visual learners to get a kind of an idea of PTSD. Children under 6 also display symptoms of PTSD a little bit differently. So here you may see children re-experiencing the trauma through play, through drawings, through nightmares, how they interact, their relationships they're developing with classmates. You may see some antisocial behaviors, you may see some aggressive or destructive behaviors. And then for this reason, in the DSM, there are specific specifiers that include different age-related manifestations. So if you're trying to say, okay, this child's 6 and they are, I think it's PTSD, and you're looking at the DSM criteria, the clinician would look for specifically age-related manifestations. And then when you are looking to intervene, when PTSD is present, you're going to be using trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. You're going to be going through CBT, I think, with Vicky this semester. And then there's another realm of it. We'll go into an advanced interventions in year 3, but it's trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, where you want to reach a place with a young person where they can be exposed to triggers of the trauma, thoughts of the trauma, and be able to cope and adapt and be able to function and navigate those experiences in a way that increases our ability to function every day. Okay. Sometimes medication is prescribed depending on the treatment modality. So that is it about this. I'm just going to get up and shut my door for a second. Any questions about PTSD? All right. Again, there are readings there on Brightspace. If you haven't had a chance to do them, go ahead and read those. They'll give you a bit more information. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Do you want to, actually, we probably won't take a minute. We'll just go into the groups. And if in your groups you want to take a few minutes, you can do that, okay? So I'm going to see how many of you were able to sign up to groups. Bear with me while I look on another screen. Okay, excellent. So there are 7 groups. I heard from Andy that some of you you're also doing a group in her class, yes? I think. Okay. And then last night we were chatting and she's like, "Are you doing a group? I think the students think your group is my group." And we're like, "Well, they always confuse us anyway. And now we did a group the same week. Like, how can we confuse you guys more?" Sorry. I hope you were able to sort it out. I think, did you have Andy this morning? Okay, so you're done with that. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to open up. This is how we're going to do this part of the class. You have an assignment available to you under the content and assignments, and it's applying a trauma-informed lens to a situation. So you're going to read a scenario, and then what you're being asked to do is report on what is happening without a trauma-informed lens. So think about kind of the vignettes we just did. How could you describe what is happening? How is the student experiencing the scenario? And then how can you understand and articulate your understanding of the scenario using a trauma-informed lens? So understanding what could be happening. And then there are a series of questions that follow each case study. In your groups, you're going to be working to answer those. You're going to submit 1 assignment per group. Once you go into your groups, I'm going to set you up with a Dropbox so you can upload the assignment directly to it. It'll be 1 per group, and then you'll all get the grade for that. Something that's useful is in your small groups, if somebody works on a Google Doc or a doc and shares a screen, that's a way I've seen this assignment work well in the past. So you're going to be given 2 young people, Maria and Jamie. And then you're going to answer the questions that are there using the format given, okay? You have, I think there are 8 groups. So what I'm gonna ask you to do is I'm gonna open up 8 breakout rooms. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm gonna let you choose your room. Don't go anywhere yet. You're going to choose the room that aligns with the group number you're in. So if you signed up for group number 2, head into breakout room 2, etc. When you are done your assignment and submitted it, if you're done by the end of class, you can head out at any point. If you don't finish it by the end of class, or you prefer to give it a proofread without the pressure of being in class, you have until midnight to submit it online. So you can take some time if you need it at the end of class to fine tune things, or so you can use the time in class to brainstorm, to talk. If you get it completed, brilliant. And if you don't, please don't feel rushed to have to get it done by 2 o'clock, okay? I'm going to leave the Zoom open and I'm gonna be here the whole time. So if you have questions, you can ask for help in your Zoom breakout room and I'll pop in. I'll pop in anyway, in and out of the rooms. And I will not, if you are in a breakout room past class time, say you're still on, it's 2:33, I'm not going to shutter the Zoom. I'm just going to leave the Zoom open until I see everyone has left. So if you want to use your breakout room to continue working, the space is yours until you are done with it. One question I had from the other group about this assignment was, let me just, was when you're looking at, you'll see there's a table, you have staff perspective, student perspective, and staff perspective with a trauma-informed lens. When they're talking about student perspective, they mean the client in the scenario. I mean the client in the scenario. So not other students, not their peers. I mean the person experiencing the situation. So it would be, for example, in question 1, how is Maria experiencing things, okay? Any questions before you head into your groups? Was that clear? So to recap, you're choosing the room that aligns with the group number you're in. If you don't have a group, don't go anywhere. I'll put you in a group. You're going to complete the assignment in class. If you need more time, you have until midnight. And I'm here if you ask for help. I'll pop into your room. Okay, so go ahead then and choose your room. I'm going to stop recording now, and I'll join you in your rooms to see how things are going.